which leads me to the second point, which is behavior. I've been teaching and participating in workshops and seminars and classes on self-improvement, psychology, positive psychology, clinical psychology for almost 20 years. Before I was 20. And what I noticed in other people's workshops or in my workshops and seminars and classes is the following. Most people, if the workshop or the class is good, exit the classroom or the weekend or the semester. If they were here before, they usually experience a relative high after. But there are two groups of people. Both groups experience a relative high. The first group, which unfortunately are the majority, after that high, go back to their base level of happiness, something we're familiar with. The second group, not the majority, but not a small minority, experience that high after. That high doesn't last forever. However, they go back, but when they go back, their base level of well-being is higher than it was before. And they continue to have their vicissitudes, but this time along a higher base level of happiness than before. Now, needless to say, I wanted to understand why people experience this, some people, and other people experience this, because I want people who take my class to enjoy lasting change, as opposed to temporary, nice, feels good, not enough. Doesn't justify the effort that they put into the workshop and doesn't justify the effort that I put into my work. So I wanted to understand the difference between the two. And here is the single most important difference that I identified between these two groups. Group 2, the distinguishing characteristic was that after the workshop or class or seminar, not at the end of the semester if it was a semester-long class, after each class or after many of the classes, introducing immediate behavioral change. They don't wait and say, okay, after the course is over, I'll reevaluate my life and see how I do. Immediately introducing real behavioral change. Doing exercises that we talked about in class. Taking risks that they haven't before, but introducing change immediately. Not waiting. And those who introduce change immediately don't have a high or a peak experience constantly, but their base level of happiness goes up as opposed to going down, returning to where it was before when there was no behavioral change. And now I start every workshop and seminar, when I have a few-day workshop or seminar, introducing this model of change. What we know from a lot of research in psychology is that there is a relationship between attitudes and behaviors. And we talked about it, we alluded to it already in the past. So we all have attitudes, whether it's attitudes about psychology, whether it's attitudes about another person, whether it's attitude about myself. And these attitudes affect our behavior. So for example, if I have a positive attitude towards psychology or positive psychology, I'm more likely to take 1504 than if my attitude towards psychology and positive psychology is negative. Or if I have a good attitude toward certain belief about a certain person, I'm much more likely to want to befriend this person if I like them than if I don't. So attitudes affect behavior. That's very clear, easy to understand. But what psychologists have found, the likes of Alice Eagley, Daryl Bem, and others, what they have found is that behavior also affects attitude. It works both ways. So if I behave in a certain way, it is likely to change my attitude in accordance with my behavior. And remember, we talked about it. Why? Because we have an attitude, and our behavior is the outside world. The mind doesn't like when there is incongruency between the inside and the outside. So if we behave a certain way, the attitude is going to be pulled down to reflect that behavior. If we behave in this way, the attitude, the mind doesn't like incongruency, it's going to create equality between the two, congruency, consistency between the two. And the way it will do that is either by changing our behavior, and here is the key, or more often by changing our attitude. Now, all of us here, whether you're 18 or whether you are 80, we all have habits. And again, we first make our habits, and then our habits make us. Habits are behavioral patterns, thinking patterns. Behaviors are more powerful, action is more powerful than words. If we have a certain behavior that we had before the class, what the class does is change your attitude about a certain thing. But if it doesn't match with your behavior, after the class, the mind looks for consistency, the attitude is going to be pulled down back to where it was before, unless your behavior changes to match your change of behavior. All a class can do, whether it's 1504 or Justice or Psych 1, all a class or a workshop, a seminar, all they can do is introduce attitudinal change. In this class, the attitudinal change is one, for example, self-esteem. What is self-esteem? The attitude that I have toward myself. High self-esteem, positive. Low self-esteem, negative. What is a benefit finder versus a fault finder? It's the attitude toward the world. Do I see it as positive, as a resource for well-being, or do I focus on the negative as a fault finder? Perfectionism. It's an attitude toward failure. But all this class can do, all I can do, all your TFs can do is introduce or encourage attitudinal changes to convince you through research that learn to focus on the positive. However, if you don't follow up with behavior, and that means doing the gratitude study, the gratitude exercise, that means writing the letter, your response paper for this week, but doing it regularly. Unless behavior is going to follow, the attitude will go back and reflect your attitude and your behavior from before the class or before the intervention. There has to be behavioral change. Let me show you some studies showing the impact of behavioral change. This was done prisoners of war in American prisoners of war during the Korean War. And what Edgar Schein, who's just across the street here at MIT, showed was that the captors of the Americans got them to change their mind about communism, about the Chinese captors. How? Gradually. By simply asking them, write about the good things within communism. We know you don't like communism, you wouldn't be fighting us if you did, but write about the positives of it. Write it to your prison mates. Write letters home, telling them how you're being treated, and making sure, of course, that they only focus on the good. So they didn't ask them to lie necessarily, though often they did, but they asked them to focus on the positive. Over time, their attitude actually changed, and they became actually more open and more positive toward their captors, because their behavior, writing letters, talking to their friends about it, they had to give lectures on it, was one of, I feel positive about this, and their attitude over time actually changed and they became more positive. Cognitive dissonance, those who've taken Psych 1 or others heard about it. Cognitive dissonance is when there is incongruence between two thoughts, when two beliefs are conflicting. We don't like it, we want there to be a match. Or when there is a conflict between behavior and a belief. And what cognitive dissonance says is that this dis-ease has to be resolved. And the way we resolve it is usually by getting our attitudes, our thoughts, our beliefs to match our behavior. Again, behavior is more powerful than words. Self-perception theory, we talked about a lot. I'm not going to elaborate on it anymore. We see ourselves and we derive certain conclusions about ourselves. Facial feedback hypothesis. If you put on a frown now, or a nice gentle smile, your body chemistry is actually going to change to reflect whatever your face is showing. So this is a quote by, where is it? By Thich Nhat Hanh. Can't difficult to pronounce his name, a Buddhist monk. Sometimes your joy is the source of your smile, but sometimes your smile can be the source of your joy. So we actually influence our body. We actually influence our mood through our face. That's why actors very often can get into whatever character they're playing simply by acting, because there is the facial feedback to the rest of your body. You actually release chemicals according with the face that you're making. William James. Whistling to keep up courage is no mere figure of speech. On the other hand, sit all day in a moping posture, sigh and reply to everything with a dismal voice, and your melancholy lingers. Smooth the brow, brighten the eyes, contract the dorsal rather than the ventral aspects of the frame, and speak in a major key, pass the genial compliment, and your heart must be frigid indeed if it does not gradually thaw. What essentially William James is talking about is something beyond the facial feedback hypothesis. It's something where there is not much research, just a little research on, which is the body feedback hypothesis. If you sit down all day like this versus upright and proud, it will affect your mood. It will affect how you feel about yourself in a few ways. First of all, the message you communicate to yourself, self-perception theory, but also in terms of how other people perceive you. If you shake hands like this, limply, versus shake hands firmly, you're communicating a message to the person with whom you're shaking your hand. And that message comes back right at you, both in terms of how they perceive you, and that impacts you, but also in terms of how you perceive yourself. You know, one of the ex-students from 1504, she played, she was on the hockey team, just graduated last year. So I met her over the summer, and she comes over and she shakes my hand, and I was in tears. It hurt so much. And I thought she must have listened in class. So don't exaggerate. Just firm, nice. I mean, really, I think she broke some of the bones in my hand. But it matters. It communicates a message. You know, I'm not going to mess with her, ever. I'm scared of her right now. It communicates a message of strength and confidence. If we walk around proud, we're communicating a certain message. If we're walking around stooped, we're also communicating a message to the environment that then reflects on us, but also to ourselves, and that reflects on us too. And finally, I want to share a study with you. This is by Hammerly. This is a study done. You know what? Actually, I'm going to leave that to next time, because I want to get to something important. So I'm going to start next time with this study, because it's a long study, but it's a very important study. So I will talk about it next time, first thing in class. I want to get to something before we end, something that will change our relationship. Fake it till you make it. David Myers has done a lot of important work in this area of positive psychology, and what he showed was that very often, even if we act happy, even if we act with high self-esteem, even if I act joyful, as William James said, that affects our mood. The question now becomes, what about permission to be human? Well, first of all, there are times when we don't want to fake it till we make it. We want to cry, we want to be miserable, and we want to act that way. However, we need to find when is it the time to get out and to go to that party, even if it's the last thing in the world that I want to do. And the difference here is about active acceptance. I can still accept my emotions, I can still accept my pain and experience it, and still choose to act in accordance with how I deem most appropriate or most helpful. So I can accept the fact, I was just dumped, say, by my girlfriend. I can accept the fact that I feel terrible about it and awful, but then 3 days later, go out to Noakes and party. Go wild. So, faking it, again, because of the facial feedback hypothesis, because of the body feedback hypothesis, because of self-perception theory, the behavior will affect my attitude. And after a crazy night out in Oaks, I will actually feel better and healthy. Well, maybe not, but better. Here's a quick video of Marva Collins talking about some of her experiences.
I think what made me what I am is my parents and the consistency. I mean, I wanted to be as successful as my parents and my grandparents. In those days, it was quite rare to be black and to be successful. So I think the determination of my parents and grandparents, we would get chastised, as I say, I'm 14 years older than my one sister. But if we walked in church and didn't hold our heads up, my mom would say, "What was wrong with you today? Walking with your head all down." She would scream down the street, "Get your head up," on my way to school. People, I've often heard the comment to her, "I can always tell your child on the playground." We were brought up with a great sense of pride.
Get your head up. Walk up straight. When you watch Marva Collins, that's how she walks. That's how she carries herself, and that communicates a message to her students, to other people, to herself. I'm going to jump to this point. So very often behavioral change is gradual. So what is the acute change? The acute change is about coping. It's about putting ourselves on the line. And when we cope, the important thing, it's to take the risk. It's to do something that we don't feel comfortable doing. In other words, it's about exiting our comfort zone and entering our stretch zone. Now, what I want to do now is share with you two stories from my past. Two stories that initially will seem unconnected, but as you will understand soon, are very much connected. One a difficult story, the other a difficult story. My first memory. Now, most people have a first memory, the first time when, the first thing that you remember. My first memory is from September 1973. I was almost 3 years old, and it was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. And I remember being at home, and suddenly the phone rings. Now, the phone, my parents, Orthodox, I was raised Orthodox, the phone never rings on Shabbat, on a Saturday, let alone on Yom Kippur, but the phone rings. Both my parents, I remember them jump up and run to the phone. My dad picks it up, and I'm standing between my parents. He looks at my mom and says something, whispering. Couldn't hear what it was, but my mom's face changes. And there is terror, fear in her eyes. And I begin to tear. And my dad picks me up and says, "I'm going for a few days, but I'll be back." Now I know what happened. So what happened was that my parents got a call from my uncle, who at that time was doing his reserves in the military. He's in intelligence, and war had just broke out. Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in Israel. The Israeli military is, most of the people are not on the borders, not protecting. It was a complete surprise. 5 Arab armies launch a war against Israel. My dad puts me down, goes to his room. From the top of I still see him taking out his army uniform, putting it on, taking his M16 submachine gun, putting it on, putting on his shoes, tying them, and my mom all the while with him, making him things. They're talking. once in a while smiling at me, but I sense a tension there. I don't know why. We then walked down to my dad's car, had a old turquoise Ford Cortina. He takes shoe polish and paints the lights off the car. Why? Again, later I know, because at night, when you drive with your lights on, you don't want the lights to be too bright in case of an air raid. So he paints the lights, and I watch him do all that. And then he picks me up and hugs me and says, once again, I'll be back in a few days. Gets into his car, and I begin to sob uncontrollably. One of our neighbors, his name is Shalom, he's too old to go into the army, so he's standing there. We all look at my dad going off in the car, picks me up, and I'm crying. And he looks at me and says, Tal, do you want to be a soldier like Abba, like your dad, when you grow up? And I say, yes, I do. Well, soldiers don't cry. And I stopped crying. And I didn't cry for almost 20 years after that. And then I came to Harvard, and I started to study psychology. You know where I'm going, right? And I started to study psychology, and studying psychology, I realized that one of the things that I wanted to work on, one of the most important things that I wanted to work on, was getting in touch with my feminine side. You know, in Jung's language, the yin and the yang, the anima and animus. I wanted to be more in touch with my feminine side because I knew that it wasn't healthy to repress emotions. I was repressing painful emotions. The exact same thing happens with positive emotions, same emotional channels. But I grew up in a culture that's very macho. Men don't cry. We're soldiers. We're tough. We can handle anything. And that's the culture that I grew up in. And again, this was my first memory. I heard the same thing over and over and over again. The same message. It's not cool. It's not manly to show emotions. It reminds me, after losing one of the most important squash tournaments for me, losing the national championships after I'd won it the year before. Surprise, wasn't supposed to lose it, was supposed to win. I go to my house with my girlfriend after, and we're just hanging out, and suddenly she begins to cry. And I say to her, why are you crying? And she said, I'm crying because you're not crying. Because she understood how important it was for me. And this is how I basically experienced my childhood, teenage, being tough, being macho. And then I came here and understood I need to let go. I need to be more in touch with the feminine side. So this is story number 1. Let me move on to story number 2. One of the students that I had here, some of you may know her, class of 04, was Lindsay Hyde. Lindsay Hyde studied with me. We had one-on-one tutorial as well. We worked a lot together. Lindsay Hyde is the founder of Strong Women, Strong Girls. Wonderful organization, part of PBHA. She founded it, now a national organization. I was also one of the founding board member of that organization. Wonderful stuff. swsg.org for those of you interested. And I was invited by Lindsay to give a talk for Strong Women, Strong Girls, for the mentors who were Harvard students, as well as students from women from other colleges around Boston. And I gave a talk, and here is Lindsay. Here she is with one of the students, third grade student, whom she mentors, and other Harvard students mentor, and do wonderful work. And I believe in this organization. I supported from the get-go almost. And I gave a talk, and the talk was about teaching the importance of role modeling. It was about integrity. Talked to them about Marva Collins and about the important work that they were doing. And at the end of the talk, which went well, I think for myself, for the participants, I got a present, a gift, a token of appreciation. And the present was a shirt. It wasn't any shirt. It was a pink shirt, a color I don't normally wear. Certainly never wore it in Israel. Not only was it a pink shirt, it was, since it was a strong women, strong girl shirt, it was also a very small shirt, more suited for the third graders than for older ones, but still they said, we want you to have it as a token of our appreciation. And then I made a mistake, and I said, jokingly of course, I was teaching 1504 at the time, I said jokingly, I will wear the shirt to class, and laughed. And here it is, the shirt that I got. And then there was another student of mine from 1504, Tori Martin, who ran the organization at that time, took over from Lindsay at Harvard. And Tori Martin said, I'm going to hold you to it. And I laughed and then almost cried. Because what do you mean hold me to it? I mean, I was joking. She said, look, you just talked to us about the importance of integrity, which I did. I mean, look here, integrity, it's even on behind. I did. And I said, that's right, I did. So what, am I going to go back on my word? That's one of my core values, integrity. And then my whole childhood flashed before my eyes, and I thought about something that Churchill said, which was, find opportunity in difficulty. So I looked for the opportunity, and here was an opportunity handed to me in a pink shirt to be more in touch with my feminine side. So ladies and gentlemen, Spring Fashion 2008. Sorry, Barry. Now, I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but believe me when I say that this for me was going out of my comfort zone. In fact, maybe it was going out of my stretch zone a little bit, but into my panic zone. And I was telling the TFs before class that when I prepare for this class, and I have all my notes, here, and I write, every time I went over it, or when I initially wrote it on my notes, there was an adrenaline rush in my stomach, going out of my comfort zone. Now, I'm also out of my comfort zone, which is why I had to have it at the end of the class, as opposed to the beginning of class. But the key is to attain optimum levels of discomfort. I may have overshot a little bit, but the key is optimum levels of discomfort. And why? There is no other way to change. I can think about it all day long and say, I want to be in touch with my feminine side, or I want to be more courageous. I want to get up. I can think about it all day long. Nothing will happen. Nothing will happen unless we bring about real, actual behavioral change. Real, actual behavioral action. And when we do that, then the sky's the limit. Thank you. I will see you on Thursday. And one thing that I skipped and I want to talk about, go back to, after we talked about the body feedback hypothesis. Do you remember the body feedback hypothesis? How you shake your hand, how you carry yourself, the facial feedback hypothesis, whether you smile, you frown. That communicates a certain message to other people who then reflect back to us. And at the same time, we're also communicating to ourselves. Am I confident? Am I proud? Or am I afraid and scared? And very often we need to, as we talked about, fake it till we make it. Because our body, our behavior sends messages to our mind, to our emotions, and affects them. There was a wonderful research done by Hammerly and second author Montgomery. Hammerly and Montgomery did the following research. They recruited shy heterosexual men. Recruited them for this study, shy heterosexual men. And the study was run as follows. These men were told that the study was about taking a certain test, and they were invited into the equivalent of William James Hall, and then they were told, unfortunately, we're running behind, so you will have to wait. You will have to wait until the study actually takes place, and in the meantime, here is a waiting room, and there are other people who are waiting for the same test, and we'll come and get you. It may take a while. Sorry, we'll pay you for it, for the time that you have to wait extra. So they ended up waiting in a waiting room, and with them was waiting another person, a female, who, unbeknownst to them, was actually a Confederate, was actually a part of the study. But they thought she was just like them, waiting in line for the study to take place. So they were sitting there for 12 minutes with a woman whose instructions was to strike up a conversation with this shy heterosexual man and to express a lot of interest and excitement about what they were saying. So they were listening and they were asking questions and wow, really, and they were laughing at what they were saying for 12 minutes. And then the woman went into the experiment, or so they thought, and another woman comes in, again for 12 minutes, and she sits down with the shy heterosexual man and seems very interested and laughs at what he has to say and asks questions and so on for 12 minutes. And then the next woman comes in as she goes into the experiment, and so on 6 times. 6 women sitting with a shy heterosexual man, being very interested in what they have to say, striking a conversation. 72 minutes total. And then they go into the real experiment, whatever it was. And then the next day, they're invited for the same experiment again. And once again, they go through the exact same procedure. For 72 minutes, they sit down with 6 women who are very interested in what they have to say. And of course, what really the experimenters were interested in was, what effect does this have? What effect does this behavior have on their shyness? And it had radical effects. So over the next 6 months, when they followed up on these men suddenly became far less anxious in general and specifically around women. They became less shy. These men, often for the first time in their lives, initiated relationships and started to date after 144 minutes of intervention. Radical difference, but there was a problem. What's the problem with many of these psychological experiments? That you have to debrief. Exactly. You have to debrief. So 6 months later, the study was over. The researchers invite the men in and tell them that this was just a study. And these women were actually part of the experiment. They were told to seem interested. Cruel, right? Well, less than they thought. It made no difference to these men, because by this time they were much more outgoing, they were doing well with the opposite sex, they were going on dates, they were less shy. It started a positive spiral. It didn't matter at all. 144 minutes, changed their lives as far as the dating was concerned, at least, if not more. Why? Think back to Bandura's work on self-efficacy. Nothing breeds success like success. When they succeeded, they did well, they saw themselves doing well, self-perception theory, certain conclusions about who they are, what they are, and that led to an upward spiral. And continued that upward spiral. Again, we talked about fake it till we make it. We then watched Marvel Collins. Chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, one of the seminal Jewish texts. Those whose deeds exceed their wisdom shall endure, but those whose wisdom exceeds their deeds, their wisdom shall not endure. If we just, remember what I talked about, if we just go to a workshop or a class and understand it on the cognitive level, even have an aha moment, a breakthrough, nothing will happen unless we follow our newfound wisdom or understanding with deeds, with action. Why? Because we first make our habits, and then our habits make us. And if we're before the workshop or class here, and then our attitude changes, but our behavior doesn't, our attitude will be pulled down over time by our habits. So it's only if we also change our habits over time. If we start doing things, if we, for example, put ourselves on the line, cope, or if we start doing the gratitude exercise or writing letters on a regular basis or starting physical exercise, arguably the most powerful intervention to deal with anxiety, depression, as well as ADHD. Unless we start doing these things right after, the change is going to be ephemeral. We're going to go back to where we were before. Lasting, permanent change, attitude change has to be matched by deeds, by behavior. Dan Millman, I mentioned him in class a couple of weeks ago, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, talks about the importance of action and change. He says, quote, "To change the course of your life, choose one of two basic methods. One, you can direct your energy and attention toward trying to fix your mind, find your focus, affirm your power, free your emotions, and visualize positive outcomes so that you can finally develop the confidence to display the courage, to discover the determination, to make the commitment, to feel sufficiently motivated to do what it is that you need to do. Or you can just do it." You know, sometimes easier said than done. However, very often, it's just jumping into the water. Just doing it, taking action, has the same effect as all the preparation, or even a better effect, and leads to an upward spiral. Okay, then we talked about coping and exiting your comfort zone. Parents, please close your eyes at this point. All right. And I ended by talking about attaining your optimum level of discomfort. What does this mean? What does this mean? So we can look at approaches to change or reactions to change, behavioral change, along the continuum of tension. Most of us, most of the time, are in our comfort zone. It's great, it's wonderful. However, when we're in the comfort zone, very little change happens. If we go a bit beyond that, we get to our stretch zone. This is what we call the optimal discomfort zone. This is where change actually happens. Beyond that is the panic zone. This is where we have anxiety and difficulty. This is a place that's usually unhealthy for change, because very often we can go back on where we were before. You can think about this with a metaphor. The comfort zone would be freezing water. The stretch zone would be flowing water. The panic zone would be boiling water. Again, a lot of movement, but out of control and potentially dangerous. The best way to be usually is in the stretch zone. You will read about it next week when you read about flow. Flow is when you have optimal level of arousal, optimal level of tension. When the task that you're doing or whatever you're doing is not too difficult nor too easy. See, what I did at the end of last class was certainly, as I said, as you saw, I hope, out of my comfort zone. However, it wasn't enough, well, maybe, but probably not in the panic zone. Why? Because I already know you. You know, we've been together for over a month. It's already past ad drop date, so too late for you. So I wasn't taking that much of a risk. It was just stretching. And it was important for me to, I mean, it really is personally important for me to do it, because it does stretch me and get me more in touch with my humanity. Or for example, let's say you want to start an exercise regime. You realize how important it is, you read the research, you're exposed to that research, you see it really has an important effect. And you start exercising. Well, if you haven't exercised for 5 years and you go out and start running, 8 miles a day, that's a problem. You're overstretching. You'll probably get injured. If you continue sitting in front of the TV or playing Game Boy, that's also not good for change. That's the comfort zone, perhaps, not good. Stretch would be okay, so let me start with brisk walking for 2 miles a day and then build it up gradually. Stretch myself, but not too much. Or if you think about starting to give lectures to others, paying it forward in positive psychology or biology or whatever your topic is, and you get anxious in front of an audience, you don't start giving a lecture in Sandra's theater. You start initially with your friends, teammates. This is how I started with my squash teammates. I gave the first lecture to, and then I gave it to my family. Gradually, out of the comfort zone, a little bit of a stretch, and then build it over time. This is the healthful way of approaching change. Sometimes though, we have to go to the panic zone. Why? Because some things cannot be changed or almost impossible to change gradually. For example, addiction. If I'm addicted to drugs, it's very difficult to say, okay, well, today I'll have just a little bit less. I'll inject a little bit less today and a little bit less tomorrow. It usually has to be abrupt. And then we're in the boiling realm. Then we're in the panic zone, quite literally at times, which is why we need help. In this area, we need someone to hold us, someone to comfort us, someone to protect us, because it is such a volatile zone and potentially dangerous. But generally, if we want to change, the healthy approach to change would be along the stretch zone. It's impossible to change in theory. I've said this so many times, and yet very often, people who take the class, as you know, many of them do change. Many of them do say, well, my life is better today for having taken it. And other people say, well, I took the class and it didn't make a difference in my life. It was a fun experience at times, the pink shirt and others, but it didn't make a real lasting difference in my life. Almost all, not in all cases, but in almost all cases, it's because there wasn't behavioral change associated with the attitudinal change or with the insights or understandings or recognition. There has to be a bias for action. And that bias for action, just to name a few examples, to increase confidence, we do it by taking risks, not by talking and thinking about or standing in front of the mirror and saying to myself, I have a lot of confidence, I have self-esteem, I'm great, I'm terrific, I'm gorgeous. Not enough. How do we reduce stress in our lives? And we'll talk about this next week. By simplifying, by doing less rather than more. And we'll talk about how actually doing less at times doesn't just lead to more happiness, it also leads to more success, more creativity, as well as productivity. But we can't reduce the stress in theory. Chipping away through the gratefulness, creating more positive channels, becoming more of a benefit finder over time. It takes time, it doesn't happen overnight. The nice thing, though, is that when we're afraid, when we think it's too much for us to take certain action, we can use our internal simulator. Remember, the mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. And if we imagine something, if we, in the CBT language, if we engage in exposure, either through the imagination or through actual action, when we engage in exposure, over time we become more confident, which is, as I told you, what I do preparing for lectures, seeing myself doing it in my mind's eye, and the mind doesn't know the difference in the real and the imagined, and over time we become more confident. It's a good start, it's not enough, but certainly goes hand in hand and a very useful technique to explore and to try. So all this is well and good, and I'm sure some of you are thinking about it, and actually some came after class last time and talked to me about it and said, okay, so we know action is important, but there's a problem. And the problem is that I don't, or many people don't, have enough discipline to engage in this action, to get out and run 3 times or 5 times a week. We're lazy. It's much more fun playing with our Nintendo than going and doing yoga for an hour, at least initially. So I don't have enough discipline for change. I just want a quick show of hands here. Be honest. Put up your hand if you believe that if you had more self-discipline, now you may have a lot of self-discipline or very little self-discipline, but if you had more self-discipline, you could potentially be happier and or more successful if you had more self-discipline. Be honest. I mean, my hand is very much up. Okay, so it's most people think that. So I have good news for you and bad news for you. I'll start with the bad because I like finishing on the positive. So the bad news is you ain't going to get any more self-discipline. What you have, what is what you got, and what you will get. That's it. Sorry. Tough luck. Most people, overwhelming majority of people, think that they need and want more self-discipline and believe that they don't have enough. And most, just about all people, cannot get any more self-discipline. Nature, that's it. So that's the bad news. The good news, it's actually not that important, neither for success nor for happiness. You can be more successful and happier with the self-discipline that you currently have. How? If you change your focus from relying on self-discipline for bringing about change to introducing rituals. Changing your focus from self-discipline to rituals. I'm going to talk about an idea now that is talked about in greater length in The Powerful Engagement by Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz, an excellent, excellent book. And what they're talking about is essentially a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift where we need to stop trying to get more self-discipline because that in and of itself is not enough for success, for well-being, for change. And it's because people rely on self-discipline for change. That's the reason why most organizational as well as individual change efforts fail. So let me share with you a fun study. This was done by Roy Baumeister, one of the leading social psychologists of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Great researcher. Here is what he did. He brought in a group of people, each individually. So the person walks into the experiment, and they're told, once again, you'll have to wait in this room, a waiting room, for the experiment to start. So the person sits down. There is a table right next to that person, and on the table there's a bowl, and in the bowl there are freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. Just came out of the oven. Smell the aroma engulfing them, like in those cartoons going into their nose. Phenomenal smell. They're sitting there next to the chocolate chip cookies that are in a bowl. The experimenter puts it down and says, I'll come pick you up in about 10 minutes for the experiment. They walk out, and as they're walking out, they tell them, oh, and just, by the way, these chocolate chip cookies, they're for the next experiment, so if you don't mind, don't touch them. So you're sitting there, almost dying, but you're not touching it. And 10 minutes later, the experiment does come in, takes you to the experiment. The experiment is a very difficult test that you need to take. A test that most people don't solve and requires a lot of perseverance and hard work. But most people, even with perseverance and hard work, do not solve it. So the outcome measure, what the researcher is interested in, is mostly how much did you persevere before giving up on that test? How much did you persevere before giving up on that test? That was the outcome measure, the dependent variable. Second group, randomly picked, come into the same room, sit on the same chair, have the same bowl on the table. But instead of chocolate chip cookies, what they have in the bowl are red beetroots. Freshly baked. Just came out of the oven. And they're sitting there. And the experimenter is about to walk out. It says, just one more thing, if you don't mind, don't touch those beetroots. They are for the next experiment. Okay, fine. So you're sitting there for 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, the experimenter comes in, takes you to the real experiment. Sitting down, you're taking the exact same test, the exact same puzzle. And once again, how long will you persevere before giving up? Think about it for yourself for a second. Who do you think persevered more? The chocolate chip cookies group or the beetroots group? Think for yourself for a second. By the way, I guessed wrong when I was asked this question. Okay. Significantly more perseverance. Significantly more. It wasn't close. The group that had the beetroots persevered a lot more. Why? When Baumeister wanted to understand the mechanism, and he did some more experiments to explain the mechanism, it's because the chocolate chip cookie group had used self-discipline not to touch. They really wanted to touch it. But they couldn't, so they used their quota of self-discipline. And when they went into the quote-unquote real experiment, what happened was that they had little or no self-discipline left. And that maze, that experiment, that test required a lot of self-discipline. The point of this study, we all have a limited amount of self-discipline. And the question is, what do we use it on? Another question for you. How many people here have, those of you who did set New Year's resolutions, put your hand up if you're fulfilled every single one of the New Year's resolutions that you ever set for yourself. Put your hand up, every single New Year's resolution, if you did set New Year's resolutions. But higher, please. Well, I certainly didn't. But here's another question for you. How many people here, this is an important question, so please put your hand up if the answer is in the affirmative. How many people here brushed their teeth this morning? Put your hand up high. Whew, I'm glad to see this. You can all come and talk to me after, real close. So let me just imagine what happened this morning, the scenario. So you got up in the morning, you were tired, and then you said to yourself, okay, today's the day. Today's the day. I am going to do it. I am going to brush my teeth this morning. Right? And to really motivate you as you got out of bed. Here I come, Rena. Here I come to brush. And you brush your teeth, right? Today is the day. Because I have 15:04. I'm going to brush my teeth. Yes! No, of course not. You rolled out of bed, barely alive. You probably don't even remember that you brushed your teeth because you were asleep still. Now, why? Why did everyone, I hope everyone, brush their teeth this morning, whereas no one person out of more than 600 students fulfilled their New Year's resolutions? Why? Because New Year's resolutions rely on self-discipline. Brushing our teeth relies on a ritual. We do it every day. It's automatic. Now, there are rituals. We know brushing our teeth is important and people won't talk to us if we don't. But we also know that physical exercise is very important. And yet most people in the world, not at Harvard, but in the world, don't do physical exercise and pay a very high price for it. It always amazed me when people used to comment on my incredible self-discipline when I was a squash player. It always used to amaze me because I don't see myself as a person with self-discipline. That we don't have chocolate chip cookies at home. And if we do, Tommy hides them. Because if they were there, they would disappear 2 minutes later. Zero self-discipline when it comes to these things. And yet, with squash, I did have what people thought was, and what I thought for many years, self-discipline. Because I would get up in the morning and go for my run. I would then go to school, and after school, straight to the courts, have a session with my coach, regular session with my coach, then play games, matches, and then, as you can see, went to the gym and worked out. Every single day. It was, and then I went home, did my homework, and went to bed. It was a ritual. That is what athletes do. They have rituals, which is why they're able to maintain what seems from the outside such high levels of discipline. At times superhuman. It's not. It's rituals. Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz. Building rituals requires defining very precise behaviors and performing them at very specific times, motivated by deeply held values. Let me give you some personal examples. Physical exercise, deeply held value for me, has always been, and especially now when I know the research, the data on physical exercise. So I have a ritual. 3 times a week, between 30 and 45 minutes, I run. After that, do my stretching. I know how important yoga and meditation is for me. I have a ritual, and I do it. First thing when I wake up in the morning, a few deep breaths. We'll talk about it more after break. It's a ritual. Every time when I teach here, every time when I get up in front of the audience, I run before. This morning, I ran. On Tuesday, I ran twice as hard. Why? Because it releases anxiety. It helps me. Globally, generally, and specifically for the class. Another very important value for me. My wife. Our relationship. See the movie, Hitch? Fantastic movie. It's a very important value for me. And therefore, my wife and I have rituals, and we have 2 ritual dates a week. Now, when people hear it, they say, oh, come on, where is the spontaneity in love? Well, there is a lot of spontaneity in terms of what we do during these dates. But the dates are set in stone. And if I'm traveling, or my wife is traveling, and we miss a date, we make up for it after. Why? Because if we didn't have this ritual, then we'd have 2 dates a decade, as opposed to a week. And a deeply held value for both of us is our relationship. In our modern world where there are so many conflicting demands on our time, rituals are not just important, they're absolutely necessary if we're to do the things that are important for us, that we care about. Other examples of rituals. Writing a thank you note. Once a week, once a month, making a gratitude visit. Once a month, or once every 2 months. Doing the gratitude exercise on a daily basis. These are rituals that we can introduce and can actually make an important difference. We also have a ritual dinners with the family as a whole. So every Shabbat dinner, Friday night dinner, we have together with the family. It's a ritual. It's a wonderful ritual. During the week, we also have days when we're together because family is an important value to us. Now, sometimes, for example, because of travel or other reasons, rituals are broken. Then you can make up for it later. There can also be negative rituals. 3 hours of not checking email. I know it's hard, but it's an important ritual. And we'll talk about the effect of having our email on constantly. Because when we're constantly connected to technology, we're often disconnected from the important things in our lives. We'll talk about that after break. Rituals, introduce rituals. One of the fears that people have when they hear about rituals is that they say, well, that will take away from my productivity, and if not productivity, creativity. Not so. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. If you look, and this is historical research, if you look at all the great artists, whether it's writers, the Hemingways, or whether it's the Da Vinci's, They had a ritual in their life, and the ritual was, for example, from 7 to 10 a.m. in the morning, I write, no matter what. 6 to 10 at night, if I'm more of a night person, I paint. They had rituals, and it's because of these rituals that they were able to be creative, because then they could think about their subject material as opposed to a million other things. Well, maybe I should be doing something else, and there are other distractions. No, there was a ritual. That's what I did now. Almost mindless getting there, just like we brush our teeth. But when they were there was space, openness to be creative. Now, the key is to give yourself time to create the ritual. You see, maintaining a ritual requires some self-discipline, but not a lot. Creating a ritual requires a lot of self-discipline. Once again, because we go back to our old habits. Let's do a quick exercise. So why don't you take your hands and just fold them. Fold your hands for a minute. All right. Now, continue to folding your hands, only this time in the opposite direction, meaning this hand below and this hand above. Yeah. I see especially the men are not really getting it, but it's okay. Now, how does that feel? Not comfortable, right? Now, this is such a simple movement, folding hands, and yet we feel very uncomfortable. Something is wrong here, and we want to go back to our folding before. Much more comfortable. We first make our habits, and then our habits make us. Okay. So the key is, here we're talking about a very simple change, folding hands. How much more difficult is it when we have habits that we've cultivated for many years and are much more significant in our lives? Very difficult to change them. It takes time. William James, as I mentioned before, says it takes 21 days to change a habit. Lauren Schwartz, in their book, The Powerful Engagement, talk about 30 days to change it. And of course, it depends on what habit. So give yourself 30 days to start the gratitude. Give yourself 30 days to build a new ritual of exercising regularly. And the key is to give yourself no more than 1 or 2 rituals each 30 days. Why? Because as we mentioned earlier, it takes a lot of self-discipline to create a ritual, and we don't have much self-discipline. Which is why when we have a list of 10 changes that we want to introduce in our lives today, we end up doing none. We end up doing none. Because we're overextending our self-discipline and we break down. It takes a lot of discipline to start a ritual, but once we start it, after a month when it's habituated, when it's grooved in, when a neural pathway has begun to form, then we can move on to the next ritual and introduce it if we're ready. No more than 2, ideally 1 ritual. Next week in your response paper, you're going to choose a ritual, 2 rituals for this month that hopefully you will also introduce, because there cannot be change without behavioral change. Lauren Schwartz, incremental change is better than ambitious failure. Success feeds on itself. We see it on the individual level. We see it on the organizational level. John Cotter from the business school does a lot of work on change in organizations, in the realm of leadership. What he talks about a lot is how you need small successes and then build on these successes. The Dalai Lama, there isn't anything that isn't made easier through constant familiarity and training. Through training, we can change. We can transform ourselves. One thing that happened to me, I remember when I was an undergraduate, and it happened to me my sophomore year. I played on the varsity team, didn't have a good season my sophomore year, was burnt out, got injured, and couldn't wait for the 1st of March. March 1 is the last, or March 2, sometimes the last day of the season, and I couldn't wait because after that, I could stop playing squash and focus on my studies. Then I could get a lot of work done, because with squash, we were at the courts, training physically for 2 hours, but total 3 hours a day. Weekends we were traveling mostly or had matches at home. Mornings, at least 2 mornings a week, we were lifting weights or in the gym. So it was rough. a lot of work, and I said, I can't wait to have the freedom without squash, especially given that I wasn't enjoying it that much at that point. Can't wait not to do it anymore and just to focus on my classes, catch up on all the readings and writings and stuff. March 1 came, I stopped playing completely, and instead of becoming more productive, I became far less productive. Now, I see a lot of you nodding, the athletes know what I'm talking about. Why did I become more, or rather less, productive? Procrastination, whoa, skyrocketed. Why? Because for years I've been told that I'm a person with self-discipline. And I started to believe it. Yeah, I have a lot of self-discipline. Look at me. I train so hard. I work, when I played on the circuit 6 hours a day. That's a lot of self-discipline. And suddenly, the squash season ended, and I said, all right, let's see this discipline at work. And I wasn't getting any work done. Why? Because I gave up my rituals. You see, during the season, those of you who play varsity or are very involved in music or a club know that. When you're investing a lot in a certain organization, your time has to be ritualized. So you know that you're in practice then, or you're at the Crimson at these hours, or you're having meetings at these hours, and after that you have to go back and work because you only have 2 hours to do it and you want to get an okay night's sleep. You have rituals, and you're productive and you're creative. And suddenly the rituals go away, and you say, okay, now I'm going to work more, and the exact opposite happens. Because we have a limited amount. It was only when I came to terms with the fact that I have a limited amount of self-discipline, it's only when I came to terms with the human nature should be commanded, must be obeyed, it was only then that I actually became productive again, because I created new rituals in my life after that. Rituals, very important and significant. The only way for lasting change.